Welcome to Evolution Equity Partners series on geo expansion, part of our wider series that will cover founder best practice on scaling. On this topic, we are going to be led by Evolution's JR Smith. JR has experienced geo expansion as a CEO himself and has since worked with many founders going through the same process. Although every country is different and every venture must tackle their market in their own way, the underlying principles are often the same, and you will hear JR refer to this. It's also why I wanted to make these videos and help more founders on their own journeys.
Thanks, Ollie. My name is JR Smith. I'm a partner at Evolution Equity and the former CEO of AVG Technologies, a small European company that went global and eventually was taken public on the New York Stock Exchange. I'm a board member, advisor, a serial entrepreneur, and an author of various books on cybersecurity and child protection.
In this series, we're going to dive into multiple areas. Firstly, what size and stage should you be before expanding? Secondly, how to identify and prioritize where to expand. How do you set your pricing strategy and business model in accordance to the local market? How do you define success and manage costs? How do these costs vary by region, and how do you handle that? We also look at the people side. How do you manage teams in different time zones? And of course, how do you do your market research right before you get going?
The content for this discussion and this particular series is going to address lots of questions around geo expansion, as in when is the right time, what's the best approach, what are the drivers behind the decision making, what should your go-to-market strategy be, how do you measure success, how do you look at skills both externally and internally? And more importantly, what you're going to take away from this series is hopefully the ability to understand some best practices, but also how to avoid some of the common mistakes that are made when you're expanding. So we're going to address how to evaluate the opportunity, options to consider, how to evaluate and understand which markets you're going to go in, and also the timing and cadence. And once you've decided to expand geographically, then we're going to go deeper into a four-phased approach. We're going to talk about how to evaluate risks and benefits, how to measure success, how to manage the actual deployment, and how to understand risks and have flexibility. And then we're going to toss in some tips and tricks to ensure that you're successful.
Okay, so on to our first proper module, which is on what stage should a company be to look to drive growth through geographic expansion. This is going to cover things such as where are you in your home market, also what are the opportunities for you outside of that home market, what are the costs going to be, and how's it going to affect the resources that you need and can use internally. So JR, looking forward to getting into this with you. Over to you.
One thing you want to initially consider is the maturity of your business and the amount of market penetration and experience you have in your home market. The reason I say that is because you've already proven out certain baseline models. You've looked at various lessons that you've learned along the way. You've probably got your KPIs locked in and pretty solid. You understand how the business will perform. You've got a good insight into timings and sales cycles. So you're pretty established in your home market. And the main thing you want to do is leverage those learnings and those understandings to ensure that you apply them to any expansion that you do, just to ensure a faster and easier implementation. Now, your go-to-market strategy is going to have a very large impact on the amount of time that you have to spend, the actual return, and your costs, and your overall growth rate. So let's discuss a little bit what those options might be. There's always the direct sales model, and this is really applicable in the enterprise setting, right? Or you can use partners, or you might combine those two and use resellers, but you have your own sales force. Those, depending on the speed and the amount of your budget, can be flexible. One area that I want to talk a little bit about that very few people actually consider is M&A. Now, if you're looking at a partner that may be selling your products and may be fairly exclusive in a certain region, then you might consider acquiring that partner. This is something I did about 4 times with AVG. We had some resellers that were doing anywhere from 6 to 12 million euros or dollars a year, and they were fairly exclusive to AVG. So we acquired their businesses and had instant people on the ground. Another example is one of our portfolio companies that had launched into Europe from the US quite aggressively, realized they didn't really have the time to manage it properly, to really make it a success. So they pulled back, and then they had just a couple people in Europe. But that's a super common story. It happens all the time. So rather than relaunch and distract the business further, they had a competitor that was producing very similar products, approaching and focused on a very similar customer base, but they were predominantly in Europe, and the company that we're talking about was in the US. And so they got to know that company, and over time they merged the two, or actually acquired it. And by doing that, they took out their biggest competitor. They had expertise and personnel on the ground instantly, and they bought, about $10 million in ARR. So that, to me, is the option I always look to first, because it's not so hard to raise money, as a startup, to acquire and consolidate a market a little bit and to get really leapfrog into a new market. Another thing you're going to want to understand when looking at your market strategy is, what are the growth targets? What is the management reporting structure? What does your organization look like? And more importantly, how much of this is driven by your budget versus just the need to increase ARR? Another area that you want to consider is what skills and assets you currently have access to that'll allow you to better penetrate a market. Mainly that's referring to resources. So you look internally at the skills of your existing team. You look at their expertise, but you also look at where they're working now, what they're focused on. Can they be distracted? And understand that dynamic. And then also you can look at partners that are outside of the company. These could be business partners that you've done work with in your home market, or that have expertise in the market you're thinking about going into. This is a great opportunity also to just leverage your network. That can be business partners, like I mentioned, but it can also be individuals or advisors. But more importantly, as you grow, you'll have board members that have portfolio companies that may be working in that geo. So you've got the expertise that they've gained as a board member in these regions, but more importantly, you might push them a little bit to introduce you to companies that they have under their investment portfolio that could also help you. And then another thing you need to consider too when looking at skills and go-to-market strategy is, is this opportunity driven by a need to increase ARR, or to just purely expand and put new logos on the board? Or can it be more organic, a little bit slower, putting your flag in the ground and moving a little bit more cautiously? So how do you determine the amount of time and the cost it's going to, or the cost you're going to incur when you come into a market? Few things to consider are the actual size of the market itself. Thus, that defines the size of the opportunity. You're going to look at, the competitive landscape. You're going to look at, are you coming in there to grab market share aggressively and quickly? Or are you passively just entering a market that has a pretty low competition and that you can take a slower roll into? I think I mentioned earlier, I call that planting the flag. And then again, as we discussed earlier, your go-to-market strategy is going to have a huge impact on, especially the costs. And also look at, do you have clients or customers that are already in that geo? So lots of times companies consider expanding because they've already got some demand in the market, but don't be driven by that. You really do need to understand the opportunity, the risks. Don't be driven because there's one or two partners, or actually one or two clients that might want to use your product, because you'll get to that and they'll still be there. But make sure you're following your strategy and your plan, and not being just a knee-jerk reaction going out chasing one or two deals. Another area that I always found interesting when expanding into new geos is what I call the 10% rule. Every consultant, every firm, every partner that you talk to in a new geo is going to tell you how different it is in their market as opposed to your home market. You need to take that with a grain of salt. I find that the variance is about 10%, most of what you know, most of the skills that you can apply towards expanding, most of the KPIs, most of the sales cycles, and sales material, they apply and they're the same. Now, if you're going from, say, the UK or the US to China or Japan, there's going to be bigger variances. But for the most part, you can stick to the 10% rule. When we talk about geo expansion, the first thing that comes to mind is the cost. And when you think about cost, it's always dollars and cents. At the end of the day, there's a much bigger impact on your organization than just the budget. So look at your internal organization and make sure that this, meaning geo expansion, is the best way for you to increase your revenues or your ARR. If you have other levers that you can pull or that you can leverage that'll get you there quicker or possibly more revenue, then do them first. And then look at, once you decide to expand geographically, what is the opportunity cost, right? So what are the current workloads of my team? And who is going to be distracted and have to manage this? Because there's nothing worse than, putting 10 people on the ground in a geo and then realizing you really don't have the resources at headquarters to manage it properly. And then they get a little disoriented. They feel like they're an island, and it really impacts motivation and your success. A couple other things are to consider our time zones. So try to keep that gap as little as possible. If you're UK to New York, okay, but if you're going, from the UK or the US to China, that's a bigger gap. So 9 to 12 hours is a stretch, but 4 to 6 hours is really doable. From a working hour perspective, once you are, sufficiently large and you've got geos, all over the planet, you're pretty much working 24 hours a day. So try to keep it under control while you can. Fight the desire to do everything. When you come into a market, understand exactly what the levers are, focus on that go-to-market strategy and pulling the levers, just like you do in your home market, that have the most impact. Don't go too far, don't go too wide, until you really understand the market and grow organically even then. Okay, so just to wrap up this first segment of this series, I think it's really important to take your learnings from your home market and leverage those. Don't believe everything they tell you about how it's so different and how the way you do it in your home market isn't going to be applicable to the new market, because it is. Make sure you do a proper evaluation of the opportunity cost. And that's really focused on the distraction to your team and making sure you understand that if there's something better you can be doing to drive revenue, then do that first. And understand that the focus it's going to take and the drive it's going to take and the commitment from management to expand geographically is every bit as important as the amount of money that you put into the budget.